Okay, that's good. Right, well, official welcome back, everyone. I think we had a very good session with looking at the research program and some very good discussions, I thought, yesterday. I think that set us up very nicely for moving forward then through the initial discussions and the review of where we are at the moment, which Ross is going to take us through, and then sort of moving us into breakouts, which we're aiming for an hour's time. And those will last an hour, and then we'll have a break for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and get some preliminary feedback from what's been said in those breakout groups. So Ross, whilst you're online, let's take advantage of that. And if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Yeah, thanks. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. And hopefully we don't have any more technical hiccups today. It's stressful enough running these virtual meetings without internet issues and power issues. But the portion of the presentation that I'm going to go through now is really meant to lead off from the discussions we had yesterday and Ian's introduction of the strategy itself, and then the discussion with Andreas and the academics who helped us with a number of research papers, and really to focus on the implementation of the strategy in the first 2 years of the strategic period, and just to recap what we've been doing under the various themes and what we've achieved thus far. And as set out in the strategy, to frame the context for the next wave of projects that we want to add to start in the second half of the strategic period. So with that in mind, just to kick it off, I wanted to highlight what I would consider quite a successful, busy period in 2019 and 2020, especially considering the context of 2020 in particular, with the pandemic, the complete impact on everyone's lives, and the total change in how the boards had to operate with little to no advance notice in doing so. The fact that we had 4 final approvals, we approved 6 exposure drafts and continued to make substantial progress on a number of other projects, I think is quite an accomplishment by the board. That's framing it too, that at the moment we have a very heavy technical work program. We often talk about this, or at least I make the point quite often when I'm talking to constituents, staff, and various other people, that there are no easy projects left. Not that there ever is an easy project, but I think every project we have has a very tough technical slant to it, and a lot of difficult public sector issues that we're trying to deal with. And I think we've experienced that this week with our discussions on both revenue and natural resources, and even the project to consider IS-26 that we think is a relatively straightforward project. It's got some issues that take some research, some good deliberation, and constituents have different views on. So I think that's setting the scene with the progress we've made, given all the challenges, I think is important. And I think it's a good start to implementing the strategy and making good use of the resources we have. With that, I wanted to touch a little bit on the progress made thus far on themes A and B, which is primarily where we spend the majority of board and staff resources. So again, the 4 final pronouncements you can see there on the screen. Huge number of technically complex exposure drafts that we've been working through, and that we'll be publishing a big batch of the next 3 or 4, well, 2 or 3 weeks actually. Consultation papers. So we've only had 1 measurement that went out in 2019, but as you remember, that was quite an innovation for the board, in that was a consultation paper that had an embedded ED in it that actually signaled some of the key principles that helped us move to the EDs that we'll be publishing in the next few weeks, ED 76 to 77 and 78. And then other documents that we don't necessarily talk about in detail at the board, but definitely staff resources and some board resources are used to help develop these. So in that other documents group, we have A&I materials or adoption implementation materials and projects we've been working on with IFAC. There are a number of projects in that group relating to both themes D and E. We have the staff Q&A documents that we work on from time to time when an issue comes about that we can add further clarification to what's already in the standards. And the climate change Q&A that we published in April 2020 is a good example of that. Again, it doesn't take a significant amount of resources, but it does take time. And that time when we're investing in that isn't taken away from other things we could be doing on key projects. So it's important to keep that in mind, that we have some flexibility and resources available to undertake such activities on emerging issues when they arise. And this is another continuation of the first two slides showing what we've worked on and why. And an important distinction here, I think, are the two far right columns, which show essentially our progress on themes A, public sector specific issues, and theme B, IFRS alignment. And as you can see, the work program has been quite heavily focused on public sector specific issues. And I would say this has been the case since the completion of the conceptual framework in 2014. And the large public sector focus that you're seeing right now and the glut of EDs, as for lack of a better word, really comes about from the completion of the framework back in 2014 and the large number of new projects the board added at that time. And we've kind of been working to knock off and complete those projects ever since, but it's kind of an inevitable bulge of technically challenging projects that we took on after we completed the framework that we're finally starting to work towards the end on. In the next couple of years, we should knock most of these issues off. And again, that's why we're talking now about what's the next wave of projects we need to add in. And I would guess primarily we'll continue to see a focus on theme A and most of our resources going into public sector specific issues, maybe even more so than now. Kind of the story with IFRS alignment is we've gone through a period where the ISB hasn't made significant large changes to any major standards that we're aligned with. And we're coming through a period where we're completing our catch up with the ISB, coming from a number of their big projects, revenue, leases, financial instruments, where we had to update our literature. And those were substantial projects we had to continue with. But there's not, in the immediate term, a number of significant ISB projects still waiting for us to address, other than their update of IS1 standard, which we're probably look at if we pick up our presentation of financial statements, financial performance project. And again, these slides speak to the reshaping of the IPSAS suite of literature, and really looking at the fact that our standards continue to become more public sector focused. So on the left side of this slide, the quarter moons to the full moon show you the degree to which our standards are focused on public sector issues. And as you can see, we're rebalancing towards more of a public sector focus within the suite of IPSAS. And we're also, on the right side, we're still managing to make progress in IFRS alignment while becoming more public sector specific, which is important to keep that balance. As we do know, we've got a number of constituents that value IFRS alignment, but we've also got to make sure as a public sector standard setter focus that we're keeping the public sector issues in mind and dealing with those. And I think we're coming through a period where we've been able to make good progress in both areas. And I think we'll continue to see the bar of the 3/4 circle and full circle extend out as we move forward and complete more projects, because again, we have mostly public sector specific issues being addressed at the moment. We've seen these graphs a few times related to the Public Sector Accountability Index, but I think this is the first time the board will be seeing the one I'm about to show you. So hot off the press, so to say, we've got the first cut of the data from 142 countries from the work it's been ongoing for almost a year now to update the Public Sector Accountability Index. And I'm happy to say that so far, the trends that we saw back in the 2018 index are holding true. So you'll remember the MAPS diagram we had in the past that showed the progress from 25% of nations on or 25% of countries surveyed on accrual in 2018, moving to up to 65% of jurisdictions on accrual in 2023. Well, for the 2020 index, or now it'll be the 2021 index, we took a poll of countries as of 2020, 2025, and 2030. And as you can see on the slide, the green bar on the right of each time period is significantly increasing as the number of countries move towards accrual. And corresponding to that, you're seeing a decrease in countries on cash and partial accrual as the completion of the transition is completed over time. I think this is quite positive because when we first started talking about the index data, there was some skepticism of whether or not these accrual reforms would continue and whether we'd see the progress that we were forecasting. And I think this shows that the progress is continuing, that the move towards accrual is ongoing and it's a positive trend. And I think directionally, it's really important for us to consider as we think about the next wave of projects, knowing that we have a significant number of countries that aren't yet on accrual, but will be moving to accrual very soon. So, you know, in the context of making the IPSAS more used and useful to users in terms of providing good information, we have to keep in mind that large number of new potential IPSAS users, and that they're going through the transition period and they'll need to see themselves in our work program and the benefits of their work in our work. Which brings us to this slide, which again shows quite positively the slice of the IPSAS pie, which is the light blue slice. So in 2020, 48 governments are using IPSAS with no modifications, and then another 8 are using IPSAS that have been modified. But if you look at the 2030 projection of 115 countries, you'll see on accrual, you'll see that almost 50% of them will be using IPSAS in some way. So it's quite a positive trend overall, I would say. And it's clear that, you know, IPSAS is becoming more influential, whether it's used directly or indirectly in national standard setters programs to develop accrual. And that's an important thing to keep in mind for a couple of reasons. One, it shows that the IPSAS are being used, but it also shows that we'll have challenges as a standard setter going forward as more and more countries do use our standards. You know, they'll be engaging in our process. They'll be looking for us to undertake projects important to them. And, you know, bringing more people into the tent's a great thing, but it also needs to be managed and it needs to make sure we're being inclusive and engaging with constituents to understand their needs overall. So this kind of brings to themes D and E, which I think are quite important to talk about for a number of reasons, because they really relate to the activities that happen less so at the board table, but outside the board by the members, TAs, observers, and staff in local, regional outreach, and the engagement strategically with a number of organizations that are quite important to the decisions to use IPSAS and how they're used. It's important to state here that, you know, although we don't have a direct project on the work program related to themes D or E, it does take resources from both staff and members to undertake the work in these areas. And particularly on a staff level, we do have quite an active amount of work ongoing with IFAC and IFAC support of adoption implementation and developing a number of initiatives going back a couple years now, but there's a couple key ones that have been ongoing for a while. So I've just talked about the index that we've been working on for over a year with the support of both IFAC and CIPFA. The update of Study 14, I think, is a quite significant and important ongoing initiative, and that's now been or going to be rebranded Pathways to Accrual. And it's basically taking that long form narrative document and turning it into more of an electronic tool that'll allow adoption implementation material, which is practical and helpful to jurisdictions undergoing accrual transition to be housed within that more user-friendly e-tool, for lack of a better word. A lot of the work we undertook in 2020 on COVID happened in this space. So it wasn't discussed directly at the table, but definitely behind the scenes, there was a lot going on with staff and various members as we worked through the issues to develop our Q&A on COVID, as we worked with IFAC and the Zurich University of Applied Sciences to develop the COVID intervention assessment tool. And obviously the work we've undertaken in the past few years on roundtables, where we've had regional members support directly these big initiatives to engage on the development of the strategy and work program, and then to discuss the new projects that we launched in 2019 as part of the strategy and work program implementation. And then under advocating the benefits for accrual, there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to touch on this in a couple slides. So I don't want to get into that too much on this slide, because I've got a more in-depth slide on a really important initiative that I want to speak about. So Ian showed this slide yesterday, and I think it's important just to, again, frame this again before we get into the discussions on which projects we want to undertake. And it really is about the number of actors in the space that really are important and critical to making sure a transition occurs and occurs successfully. So the IPSASB in its own right is not likely to drive a transition completely, and I would say it'd be set up for failure if people were relying just on the standard setter for a transition. It really does take some engagement and support from all levels of all actors involved in the transition, as shown on this slide, to make it successful. Firstly, to get the decision to even adopt accrual and move. The political will is always the first critical step. But then to actually implement, you really do need the support of all these organizations in some way, shape, or form to make it happen. And that's really what this slide's about. And again, we have been focusing on practical guidance as the standard setter and with the support of IFAC through the profession that we can help with. But there's a lot to happen broadly within the profession, governments, and the supranational regional organizations as well. And not to negate the importance of the auditor in the decision to move to accrual, as well as the successful transition to accrual. So always important for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about our standards is, the role that others play in making sure those standards are used. And then again, this slide was yesterday, but ever since we've developed this slide, it's been helpful to me in particular as a staff member to really think more broadly about what we're trying to do when we develop a standard. And of course, we're trying to develop public sector financial reporting guidance. But I think even more importantly is that data that we develop that's used to produce the financial statements has several uses in the public sector. And it's important we continue to advocate those. And as I said, there's a number of important initiatives happening under Theme E. And on the next slide, I'll talk about the one that I think is significantly important related to the statistical accounting community and making sure the information's used for more than just financial reporting. In this space, it is really important that we work with the international organizations and the regional bodies. And we've done a good job of that over the first couple of years of the strategy. And we have intentions as we go forward to continue with roundtables and partnerships on a regional basis to try and make sure we're engaging with more and more constituents. Obviously, COVID's thrown a bit of a curveball at us, and a lot of the planned in-person events that we had in 2020 and into 2021 have had to be reimagined. But I think we have been quite successful as a staff and a board to pivot in using virtual. And aside from technical issues such as power outages and internet issues, I think we've been largely successful in utilizing technology in a new way. And I do think once we return to whatever the new normal is, that we'll be more nimble and agile and able to engage with constituents in more ways.
Well, so I wonder before you move on to the next slide, whether we might just pause at that point and see if there are any comments, questions that board members want to raise.
Sure.
If you can just stop sharing your slides, and then we can see whether there are anybody want to make any points or anything at that stage. Yeah, I've got Lynn, then Adrienne.
Thanks, Ian. So, Ross, my question was, when you put the pie charts up, it was clear that where most governments adopt, they do so with modifications, or there's another big chunk that have sort of national standards that refer to IPSAS. Is there any research? Do we understand the most common modifications where those are made, and has any work been done on that? Because that might help inform the standards that people are finding most difficult, or might also drive us to think about revising those standards that are often modified.
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at that. And again, we haven't done specific research to that level. Even getting the information in the index itself is quite challenging. But anecdotally, I would say the standards that you find most challenging, or the issues you find most challenging, I think are where you see the most departures. So I think when you're seeing, well, I guess there's two issues baked in this that I want to note. The first issue is sometimes I think we're seeing that jurisdictions are less apt to give the sovereignty to standard setting directly to a standard setter. So they want to use a national endorsement process. So that's part of why you're seeing the split in the slides. And then I do think there's an element of wanting to adopt them in a certain way. So they don't want to adopt the full suite. And I think that's where the challenges come in, where entities over time might plan to move to the full suite, but they're doing it incrementally. And I think they're leaving some of the harder standards to the end. And again, as I said, it's anecdotal. I don't have hard and fast evidence, but from what I've seen from talking to people over the years and other staff, I think is sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat. Consolidation standard is a challenging one that people tend to pick up very last, and that's one that because of how they define their public sector and how we define consolidations, they're sometimes hesitant to pick it up because of the scale of work and doing a whole of government consolidation. The financial instrument standards have been ones that people have been slow to pick up, or maybe delayed picking up. Those are probably the two biggest. And then in some jurisdictions, we've seen in other ad hoc reasons for picking up one standard over another. But yeah, I would say if there was one that I would say is problematic, and I'm not sure there's a technical solution to help, it's probably consolidation. I don't know, Ian, if you had any comments.
I think you've covered it fairly well, Ross. I mean, I do think that one of the things that you do see is this reluctance of sovereign governments to just hand over directly to, basically using our standards directly. And I think that may be something that changes over a period of time. I mean, I was quite interested by a discussion I had with Lucy about what's going on in the Philippines, where at the moment they have their own Philippines public sector accounting standards, but actually, she's been advocating for a move to direct IPSAS adoption, precisely because actually, although they have that endorsement process, the modifications are minimal. And a lot of countries sort of, one of the reasons for moving to accrual is to be transparent. And so, countries like, I think, Tanzania and also, say, Colombia are direct adopters of the standards, precisely because they see that, being held to account to international standards is a really important thing. And I suspect as you see more people adopting IPSAS around the world, that will become more prevalent. Adrienne, and then Mike.
Thank you, Chair. Just a minor comment on the last diagram that was shown by Ross. If it takes a village, and if auditors are to have a leverage effect on the adoption and implementation of IPSAS, how would, for instance, InterSci or, well, for the IPSAS, the Eurostat, find a place in the whole picture? Or could they? or do we want them to?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Hervé and Adrian. IPSAS definitely plays a role in the process, and we've got a number of different touch points with IPSAS. So I think probably one of the most powerful ones is those from supreme audit institutions that actually sit around the table themselves. But then on a more strategic level, we have engagements with IPSAS through the Financial Audit and Accounting Subcommittee meetings and participation there. So I've been participating in those meetings going back to 2016, I believe, where we go and present updates on our work program priorities, and we hear about challenges that the various members of that group as representatives of IPSAS experience in their various regions and jurisdictions in both the adoption of public sector accounting standards, but also the international audit standards set by the IPSASB. And they're also engaged through that process. So we have a very fruitful and useful exchange of dialogue with that community through that mechanism, as well as through IFAC and IPSASB and other different groups within the IPSAS network, including the Public Interest Committee, where we have an IPSAS rep as well. So it's kind of a web of connections rather than one clear strategic one, but I think that's more related to how IPSAS actually works as a network as well.
Yeah, if I can pick up the IPSAS point, I mean, we haven't got it on the current agenda, but Eurostat are an observer on IPSASB, and we do get regular updates from them on the progress of the IPSAS project. And you know, over the years, I've also been I regularly present to the IPSAS working group, and I'm involved in their working group, their cell meetings, and so there's a very strong dialogue. And indeed, actually, if you look at those who do not have their camera on at the moment, if you look at page 2, you'll see John Verinder from Eurostat is actually observing the meeting at the moment. So there's a very strong link there. Okay, so I will go to Lucy and then to Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'm happy to inform you that we have shifted as direct implementer of IPSAS, and we have renamed our standards to IPSAS, although we have some Philippine application guidance, but this is also permitted in the standards. The reason why we shifted from to direct to the approach of direct adoption is that we would like to have we would like to ease consolidation, because if there will be some divergence from the standard from the IPSAS, then there are challenges in the consolidation. But of course, we will be discussing some of the issues that we have actually noted, especially for the small and medium public sector entities like local government units. And that's why, well, I am so happy that we are considering working on differential reporting, because I think this might ease the implementation of the standards. Because right now, the agencies, the entities, you know, they don't have any way but to strictly implement, because that is what we require. But we saw also the challenges that they are meeting, that they are facing, that sometimes it would result in delays in submission of financial statements, because they have to conform to the requirements of the standards. So, but at the moment, we in the accountability index of SIPA and IFAC, we already changed our status from indirect implementer to direct implementers. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. And you're right about the challenges around the smaller bodies. Ross and I were there for an event at the Commission on Audit, I think the end of 2019, wasn't it? And there was some very passionate exchanges with the local authority, the smaller local authorities, the barangay representatives there. So we know, we've seen that tension firsthand and that desire for appropriate guidance. So go to Thomas and then to Murray.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just want to come back to what Lynn just said. Actually, I think it's really important to understand what are the modifications. It's important for kind of the themes around advocating and supporting implementation. I think the first issue from what I see broadly is to answer the question, what is a modification? Because modification can be different things. It can be either really kind of modifying the guidance, or it can be what very often happens, just deleting options. This is also already a modification, but this is probably much more in line with our guidance or with IPSAS as kind of introducing new guidance. So that's the first point. The second is I can only support what Ross just said. I think the biggest challenges are around these standards, which introduce conceptual differences to cash-based accounting. So all standards around provisions definitely provide a challenge, which is IPSAS 19, IPSAS 39. Also, financial instrument provides a challenge for implementers. And of course, as the most reform projects are conducted in phases, focusing firstly on single entities and single financial statements, consolidation very often is pushed back in projects and very often modified as well, kind of replacing line-by-line consolidation by at-equity consolidation, just to make it easier as a consolidation process. So that's just to add what Ross just said.
Thanks, Thomas. And I think looking at the chat, actually, John Verinder has posted something from the European perspective that they found consolidation, employee benefits and financial instruments, some aspects were the kind of key challenges. And that was based on a detailed survey at European level. I mean, I think just to pick up the data quality issues with the index, certainly we've tightened up definitions and we will continue to work on that. But it is, you know, as Ross has said, it's extremely challenging to get good quality data from around the world. And, you know, that is limiting us at the moment, I would say. So, you know, don't expect a scientific answer on that out of this update. But, you know, we will need to continue to work on that going forwards. And just on the data, if you can respect the fact that at the moment it is very much draft, we're still in the final stages of getting data in, and there's quality assurance work that has to go on. So we're not releasing it publicly at the moment. This is purely to inform the discussions here. The likely publication date is sometime in June this year. And it'll, you know, it'll be available in web form as well as a short document as per last time. But just to say that, so if you can respect that, and when we post the slides, we won't include that draft data in that. But, okay, so I've got Mari and then Nima.
Thank you. Back to the Adrian's comment. IPSAS interest is not in the accrual-based information, but in the financial audit and performance audit. And also the IPSAS focus is on the how to contribute to the SDGs. So it is important to emphasize the usefulness of the accrual-based information to IPSAS. And another point, modification, as to the modification, every country has a different institutional budget system and institutional accounting system, and so traditional is different. And so the how to use the accrual information both in the budget and budget execution and the performance evaluation. It is so important to develop. We have to develop the modification about explore the modification. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And I think that's one of the discussions that needs to be taken further in the context of possible projects on financial performance, because that's an area where there's definitely room for improvement in terms of it's an old standard and it can certainly be made much more useful through thinking about the sorts of issues that you raised. Okay, so I'll take a final comment from Nina, and then we'll move on to talking about the government finance statistics.
Thank you very much, Ian. I just wanted to share our experience on this side. We have in East Africa and Southern Africa, through the IPSAS for Accountant Generals, and also the Association of Auditor Generals and Professional Accountants Organizations, formed that with the Accountancy Professionalization Initiative. And right now it is sort of an agreement that at least in the coming 3 years, most of the governments have put 3 years, they should be able to comply directly with IPSAS. And actually, it is a bit easy to go to direct because most of the countries did not have their own local accounting standards. And most of them have been really interested. We had a meeting last week and they had another meeting yesterday on the projects which are going on as to whether they will simplify some of the implementation challenges or they will make it easy. And as a result, really, I'm looking at the projects which are coming, whether it is on presentation of financial statements or differential reporting or tax expenditure, and what impact will they have, at least to be able to bring them back home on this side and assist in the implementation of IPSAS to be able to achieve the objectives. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nina. I think there's a lot going on in Africa at the moment, and that's going to be one of the areas that we really want to keep track on and support. And the regional organisations are really important in Africa in particular. Okay, so Ross, move us on then to talk a little bit about government finance statistics, and then we'll also then move into talking about theme C.
Great. Hopefully everyone can see my screen again. So as I alluded to before we had a discussion, one of the really important initiatives under theme E is the International Statistics Standards revision process that is undergoing at the moment. And from a staff and board perspective, we've been involved in these discussions going back to an IMF event in early 2020, I think it was in May, in trying to bring forward some issues to be considered through this process. And this process happens fairly infrequently, so the opportunities to get involved in the discussions around the development of statistical guidance, they're not always available in there. So it is a good opportunity, given the progress in developing and building out the IPSAS suite since the last update, to engage, share our experience in our own GFS alignment process. And I'll get to a couple of slides that I'll go relatively quick on that show some staff work in this area and how we're identifying areas of possible alignment on this. But it's important to note that we do have significant resources that we're putting into this. So Joao has been working on GFS for a number of years, both in a professional capacity, but while he's been with IPSASB in developing the GFS tracking table that you see posted for each meeting. And for the last couple of years, he's been developing in incremental bits GFS dashboard that I'll kind of run you through at a high level on the next slide. And through our engagement with the statistical community and getting involved in this process, we're getting involved in a number of different task teams and the GFS advisory committee, and Joao's representing the staff in those discussions. But to bring it together on the staff and the board side, we've also got a working group that we've established that includes Ian, Adrienne, Mark, myself and Joao at the moment. And when we get into specific different discussions, we bring different staff in and out of those discussions as needed, and we'll continue to do so going forward. But it is really about a two-way dialogue process that we're trying to establish to show where we think there's opportunities for alignment, and both on our side, but on the statistical side, again, with the aim of making sure that information from captured through the accounting systems is useful and used for multiple purposes. So as a good high quality data input for statistical accounting, primarily in this case. And with that, I'll take us to the alignment dashboard. So on this slide, you can see the current legend for the alignment dashboard that we've developed. And this is looking at the IPSAS standards and whether we're aligned with GFS. And the way we do that is by looking at the various accounting requirements and options within a particular standard to determine whether within the IPSAS guidance there is a GFS aligned option related to the recognition and measurement from an accounting perspective. And then we identify where there is an IPSAS alignment opportunity. So this under B on the slide here, this is where we can do something within an IPSAS project or initiative to further clarify or align our guidance with the GFS community. But we also identify things from the GFS side where we think there's a possibility through the GFS process to clarify the GFS guidance to align with what we have in our guidance. And this reflects the fact that we're constantly updating our guidance, and there's a possibility that there might be a chance for the GFS side to further clarify how developments in accounting might impact them. And then D is probably the hardest of the two, and that's where there's a conceptual issue, either on our side from a financial accounting perspective or on the GFS side, where just because of the fundamental different natures of the frameworks, there's a conceptual difference at the moment that prevents an aligned option within the IPSAS and on the statistical accounting side. And this is where the GFS ISS update process is important, because in some cases, the update process might actually deal with some of these conceptual issues. And that's what we're trying to engage with and understand through our work in the GFS process, is to really make sure we're informing where we are on our standards and where those opportunities exist from our perspective in their discussions when they're happening, so that any opportunity to align isn't missed if there's a decision to align. And this is what the dashboard looks like at the moment. And just to note, this is completely draft. We haven't had discussions with the board on this yet. We've been working with this with a select few people at this time. Joao's been developing this for, I think, over a year and a half, maybe even 2 years now. And we've gone through various iterations through discussions with Ian, statistical observers, and just amongst staff, and kind of going through each of the issues, looking where we think the alignment challenges are, and then how we codify those using the legend. And I don't want to get into too much detail on this now, other than it's been a really useful exercise on the staff side, working with various members to look at this and think about, objectively where differences exist and how they might be solved, and then the magnitude of whether it's a difference or not, and the type of difference when looking at the legend I showed on the previous slide.
And Ross, just before you finish off on that, we will bring an update, a more detailed update to the board in June, because at the moment there's quite a lot of moving parts in terms of where projects are going forward and where we're involved and so on. So we will update properly on that and allow for some discussion in June on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's a great point. And then bringing us to implementation in the last theme, that again, it's discussed in detail in the papers, so I won't go down into every detail, but I will remind you, when we finalized the strategy, the board decided at that time not to bring on anything under theme B or theme C, broader financial reporting issues. So that's reporting outside the financial statements, but to engage with various jurisdictions in that space and keep a watch on developments and activities in that space. And it's been quite interesting to watch that space the last 18 months and particularly the last, I would say, 6 to 8 months, as on the private sector side, there has been a lot of interesting movement and overtures from the ISB to potentially develop a sustainable reporting board. And we think it's quite important that the IPSASB continues to monitor that space and watch the developments overall. But at the same time, we think it would be premature to direct the limited staff and board resources we have to take on a project until we get some more clarity on what that space is going to look like and how it all shakes out in the private sector side. Because for one, that should become more apparent in the next year. And as soon as November 2021. But until we know what that framework is going to look like, what it will address, how it will address it, it feels quite premature to commit formally to bring a project onto our work program when we have other priorities to still address. So I guess where we're landing on theme C is not all that different from where we were when we finalized the strategy. We think it's quite an important area for the board to continue to monitor. We think it's important we're involved in these conversations and following what's happening related to the Sustainable Reporting Standards Board and the various other related sustainable reporting boards that already exist, and that we're engaged in that discussion. But we do not recommend a project at this time because we still struggle to define what that project would be and how we would take it forward at this time. And it's probably a better use of resources to wait a little bit longer and see how everything shakes out before we really dive into that. So that's the main recommendation, and that concludes my part of the presentation. And we've kind of stopped for questions already, and we have to move on to Davey. And I'm not sure if you want to take some more questions now before we go to Dave.
Well, I'd just like to check on that slide that you've shown in terms of the recommendation there, because I think it is an important recommendation for the board, and I just want to check whether there's any disagreement with that proposal. So if you can stop sharing and I'll take questions. So I've got Adrienne and Scott.
So it's not a disagreement, it's more of a comment that I think, given the development of sustainability reporting, public sector entities will be pressured to start doing this. And so I think our waiting should be only for a short period. In particular, a reference point that we all have is COP26, the Glasgow Climate Summit in November. And I think it would be helpful to have some kind of guidance before then. So maybe it's a question to you or to Ross, in what time frame underlines that last slide? Thank you.
So thanks, Adrienne. I mean, I think, you know, the problem is we don't know what the timeframes are for the IFRS Trustees Initiative. We already have guidance, and this is in the staff Q&A, which does enable people to move forward on this. And I think we can do more to communicate the frameworks that are already around. And there are a number of different frameworks like SASB, GRI, and so on. So the point is, you know, we should do more to communicate what's available in terms of tools at the moment. But the recommendation is that certainly in the next 2 years, we should not be taking on an additional project in this space, because the risk is, frankly, with all this activity and with the existing frameworks, that we end up going ahead of what happens elsewhere, take up a lot of resources, and then we end up basically in the sort of situation that you ended up with when, you know, you had sort of Betamax and VHS, and you end up on the wrong side of the debate. So I think, you know, what we should be doing is communicating the tools that are available, engaging with the debate, but not try and run ahead, is what we're saying at the moment. So, you know, because there's actually, as you can see, there's a lot of other things where we can you know, and need to actually put some resource. And this is important, but actually at the moment it's probably not the place where we should actually be putting a lot of staff and board time. So that's really the recommendation. So we're looking at the next 2 years, and in that time I think there will be a lot greater clarity about what the reporting landscape looks like. And you know, so that's really the proposal. So if I take Scott, then Mike, then Lynn, then Todd.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I almost put my hand back down because my comment's the same thing as Adrian was, but I would like to comment that I hope we will do some monitoring. My question was how long? You said 2 years, I got that. But one thing that's really changed is this has moved significantly from more of the not-for-profit focus to the business roundtable stepping in and really driving this now. I think you're going to see lots greater speed than it has been in the past. And I think 2 years is stretching it. And so I would encourage us to be very close monitoring it at least. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Yes, very much agree with that close monitoring. And just to fill in a bit on that, I have a conversation coming up with Lee White, who's the Chief Executive of the IFRS Trustees, who's very much leading on all these proposals in the next couple of weeks, precisely to discuss that. How do we input to this and so on. And also, I think, as you've seen, there's a very strong line in from the IFAC side as well, through Kevin Dancy, the Chief Executive. So this is, you know, this is not just something on paper, this is something that's actually happening at the moment. Okay, go to Mike, then Lynn, then Todd, then Lindy.
Thanks, Chair. And I suppose I agree with everything that's been said. It's good that we're monitoring. It's good that we're across these things. We know what's going on. I'd be cautious a bit like you. Whether it's 2 years or 1 year, let's just keep on top of it. One thing I thought I would mention though is I did some research on application of long-term fiscal financial sustainability reporting in 4 or 5 jurisdictions in Australia and New Zealand last year, and found that more and more jurisdictions are starting to report that sort of information to their parliaments, and the frameworks are all different. So I think there's an opportunity there for somehow to get them to be using our framework rather than frameworks that they make up themselves.
Thanks, Mike. Go to Lynn, then Todd, then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. So I think I'm going to echo some of what everybody said. I agree with where we've got to. My point was to pick up communication. We could communicate our position silently, which makes it look like we are not doing anything, or we can communicate a proactive position that is well considered. And I would be in favour of us thinking about a proactive position statement communication so that people don't think we have ignored the matter.
Thanks, Lynn. I mean, I think we will take that away as an instruction. Certainly, Russ and I have talked about the fact that we probably need a specific web page that focuses, you know, on guidance available and so on. And I think, you know, what we say in the consultation is going to be the time when we actually do make that strong statement. Lynn, but you're right, we do need a strong and clear position on this. Todd, then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. Lynn has made the point that I wanted to. I think it's really important in the consultation document that we are going to put out that we do address this issue, because I think it is important. I think it will be important in the minds of our constituents, and so communicating with them about why we're not bringing something onto our work program now is very important. And I'm happy for something fuller to be on the website, but we actually have to have something in our consultation paper on this that would link into that website and explain our position.
Thanks, Todd. Lindy, then Mike, you wanted to come in again, and then I'll go back to Ross.
Thank you, and previously, as well as the recommendation, be clear what would be the expectation on the board and the staff. I do agree that we should monitor and try and influence these different frameworks and the directions they go, but I would caution to even signal that the board would issue something from a private sector point of view, because I think they should be generic enough that if you're a reporting entity in a specific sector, you should be able to apply it. So we need to be very careful that we don't create a public sector specific angle to something which I'm not too sure if there is a need for. So I think we need to think what it would be that we do in the future and start signaling that or it. But I think we need to be careful. There's already something in a differential reporting, there's already
we're losing you, Lindy, but I think we get the sense of what you're saying. Thanks.
Yeah,
okay, so I go to Mike and then to Ross. And Adrian, I'd rather we move on. I think we get the sense of that members feel strongly about this. I think let's continue the conversation in the context of what the communication will be. Mike, then Adrian, then Ross, but I am going to move us on. I think we get the sense of where we're going on this.
Okay, so I'll keep it really short. Thank you. It was just to add that maybe we need to be nimble as we were with the climate change Q&A. So be willing to do that, but I recognize resources are tight.
Adrian, then back to Ross.
Just a specific response on what Lindy said. I think by the definition of sustainability reporting, the public sector will be different than the private sector, because the distinction being for profit and not for profit, and sustainability reporting immediately brings you into, is there a stewardship or social goal that's not profit? And so rather than saying I think it's unlikely that there'll be a difference, I fear there'll be an enormous amount of difference, and we need to kind of grasp it and define it ourselves, or other people will define it for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. I mean, I think, you know, the trouble is we just don't know at the moment, because if you look at integrated reporting and the integrated reporting framework, other than the fact that that has some terminology issues, you know, in terms of capitals, actually, if you just call them resources, the guidance actually works perfectly well for the public sector. And so I think we, you know, again, that's the caution that we just need to wait and see where this is heading, and then we can determine, is there, you know, is this likely to produce generic guidance which won't require modification, or actually, you know, this is just going to be for the profit sector and it's not going to be more generically applicable, in which case we need to do something much more substantive. And at the moment, we just don't know where this is going to play out. So that's really the nervousness. But I think, you know, I think it's been useful to have this discussion and to see the strength of views from members, and also the fact that we do need to be very proactive in terms of our communication, in making public sector organisations aware of the resources already available from us and from other organisations. And then I think Mike's point about being nimble becomes really important as well. You know, and probably we ought to make sure that we've got regular updates to the board on what's going on as well. Ross, to you for the final word, and then we'll move on to Dave.
Yeah, it won't be a long one. I thought Lynn's point was a great one, because I think sometimes we've been approaching this discussion from a very defensive position, that we haven't done anything or we've done nothing. But actually, we already have 3 RPGs in this space, including one that focuses on the long-term sustainability of an entity's finances, which is central to this discussion and takes a public sector perspective. So I think actually we're ahead of the curve on the public sector side when you look across other international organizations in this space, and that communication should take credit for that, because if people are going to ask us to bring this on their agenda, I think the ask back should be, what are you doing with what we've already got in this space? And if you're concerned about this, look at the RPGs that are out there and have been there since 2014, 2015. So that's, I just think, an important point to keep in context of how we communicate this. that we're positive on what we've already done in the space and that we're monitoring it for further developments.
Thanks, Ross. James, you want to come in? If you can make it brief, because I'm mindful that we're now losing time. So, and I want to get into the breakouts. James?
No, very briefly, I just want to say your approach on this issue, on talking up what you have and standing ready to act, as is entirely consistent with the direction that the audit and the ethics boards, your sister boards, are taking on the exact same issue.
Right. Thanks, James. And I think, we need to carry on those discussions that we've had across the three boards during the last year. Actually, it would be quite good to loop back on that maybe, to make sure that we are consistent and, we're all communicating consistently. Okay. So Dave, move us into the next section. Mindful we're just running slightly behind time at the moment. So the trouble is there's so much you can cover. So Dave, over to you, and welcome back from your power outage.
Oh, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? My Zoom settings reset. I just want to make sure I'm not speaking to no one. Oh, perfect. So as Ian mentioned, the breakout sessions are coming up. I want to make sure that we allocate the full hour to that. So I will try to set those up in the next 15 minutes or so. When we look at this overview slide, and the slide that you've seen a few times now, the first box is what Ian walked you through yesterday, and this was really reminding you what's in the strategy and work plan. Then Andreas took you through the academic advisory group and what they're working on, and Ross just took you through how the IPSASB is delivering on the strategy and work program. What I'll try to do in the next 15 minutes or so is I'll try to take those three presentations and take all the information from them and frame them so that you can have a good discussion on the mid-period work program consultation in your breakout sessions. So I use the word framing because that was important to me when I started working on this project. And when I looked at the 2019 through 2023 strategy and work program, it actually frames this mid-period consultation in a really succinct way. In the strategy work plan, the board had the foresight to see that about halfway through the period covered by the strategy work plan, the environment will have changed and staffing resources will start to become available to take on new projects. So what the IPSASB committed to in the strategy work plan was to publicly consult on which topics or which projects it should add to its work program. Now, this is really important because the mid-period consultation is therefore limited to the work program itself. So what Ian presented yesterday on the strategy work plan and reminded you what was in there, that's not on the table today. So the overall objective in the strategy work plan, the activities, the two activities that support that objective, and then the 5 themes, those are all off the table. So from my perspective, when I started looking into this, that really sets up what I like to call the sandbox or frames the discussions that we'll be having over the next quarter or so. The other aspect of the strategy and work plan that I thought had a lot of foresight relates to not only framing the sandbox, but also telling me and outlining for the board what the rules are that you can use to operate within this sandbox. And you'll see the last bullet on this slide, and that's the project prioritization criteria. I won't get into them here, but these are 4 criteria that the IPSASB consulted on with its stakeholders and ultimately made it into the strategy work plan program, where we committed to apply these when we're evaluating new projects. So because this is a limited scope project, we think we can make significant progress on this project in a fairly short period of time. We also have a pretty firm stop date on this project, which is early in 2022, because that's when resources become available. If I go to the far left of this slide and I look at the red box here, this is where we are right now. In December, Ross and Ian gave a quick overview of the work program consultation. For this quarter, we've been really working on setting up a strong breakout session because we really want this to be an IPSASB-led initiative. We really want you to drive what projects we go out to constituents on and ask them whether we should add to our work program. Coming out of these breakout sessions today, staff will take that information and begin to draft the mid-period consultation. And we'll draft that in conjunction or with the task force. And the task force will made up of 6 members, 4 of which are the chairs of the breakout sessions that we'll move into later today. In addition to working with the task force, next week we are going to engage with the PIC. And then hopefully in mid-May, we'll have an in-period meeting with the CAG in order for them to look at an early draft of the mid-period consultation. We wanted to engage with the CAG in May rather than in June because we wanted to make sure we could take their advice or incorporate their advice into the document so that we could bring it back to the IPSASB in the most complete way possible for the June meeting. The only other point I want to make on the red box is what we're hoping to do, and this will probably be in mid-May as well. We're hoping to reconvene the breakout groups that we have today so that we can show them an early version of the document. And they can provide advice on the document at that time as well, that we can flow into the June version that the IPSASB will review again. In June 2021, we're expecting to approve the mid-period consultation for a 4-month consultation period. And then over the exposure period or the consultation period, which should be July to October, we'll be holding regional roundtables and we'll engage directly with national public sector standard setters. And this is to augment or encourage written responses and make sure that we hear from as many stakeholders as possible. Obviously, coming out of this exposure period, staff will perform a review of responses. The IPSASB will review those responses at December 2021. We'll also engage the CAG at that point, and we'll engage with the PIC at that point as well. And then finally, that wraps us up in March 2022, where we hope to add projects to the work program. And like I said, it's important that we meet that deadline because that's when resources become available. So we want to make sure that we have projects for staff to work on at that point. So if on my sandbox slide, I talked about how we're really focusing on the work program. And what that means from the IPSASB's perspective is that really focuses on theme A, public sector specific projects, theme B, IFRS alignment projects, and theme C projects, although in Ross's section, we just decided that now is not the most appropriate time to add a theme C project. So what this slide covers is how the environment's changed and what we need to consider when we're thinking about each of these themes and adding them to the work program. The reason that we focus on theme A and B projects is these are the projects that we control. So this is what we add to the work program. As Ross mentioned, theme D and E projects are not led by the IPSASB, they're led by other organizations. And it's important we keep resources available, but we don't add them to our work program because we don't have ultimate control over these. A really good example is the GFS or ISS revision that Ross just talked about. Obviously, this is led by other organizations, but it's very important to us, so we need to keep resources available. Ultimately, that initiative might lead to some theme A projects. There might be some standards that we can update in order to better align with GFS, but we don't directly include that in our work program. With regards to theme A projects, some things that we'll need to consider are, firstly, the world's changed quite a bit since we issued the strategy work plan. Part of that's because we've moved ahead with our strategy work plan, and there's more adoption of accrual, the use of accrual accounting, and more adoption of IPSAS in general. So as a result, we need to consider the practical challenges of applying IPSAS and supporting those that are moving to IPSAS or accrual accounting, supporting them with more useful and usable standards. The other bubble here, government financial statistics update, I just referred to, and that might result in us adding some projects to theme A as a result of support we're providing through theme D and theme E projects. The theme B projects, maintaining alignment with IFRS. I don't have a lot to say here. again, as we move through the strategy and work plan, we accomplished quite a bit, and some of those were issuing IFRS aligned standards. So what this means for us is there's fewer and fewer projects, or fewer and fewer IPSAS that aren't aligned with IFRS. So there's fewer projects for us to select. And of those projects that aren't aligned, there's even some that aren't relevant. So IFRS 2, share-based payments, isn't relevant to the public sector. And then the last bubble I won't talk to, but these are our theme C projects that, as I just said in Ross's presentation, we agreed that now isn't the most appropriate time to add those to our work program. So if my sandbox explained where we are and where we can play in the mid-period consultation, what this slide touches on is how I built the population of projects that we'll be discussing in the breakout sessions in about 10 minutes. And where I started with the population of projects is when we released the strategy and work plan, accompanying that document, we issued a summary of the consultation, or how we got from the consultation to the final plan. And in that document, we listed all the projects that were discussed during the consultation period. I took that list of projects, and then applying these 3 buckets, I put them into buckets, or using these criteria, decided whether we should add to that list or remove from that list. The projects that I removed from the consultation list mostly related to projects that we've either started or finished. So they obviously fell off the greater population. The only bucket I really want to touch on here is the last one, the maintenance projects. What we identified as staff were 3 maintenance projects. The first one was IPSAS 21. This is impairment of non-cash generating assets. The reason why we identified this as a maintenance project is through discussions last year and even up till February, when we started developing ED 77, this presented some challenges in how value in use is applied in IPSAS 21. The board talked about this might be an opportunity to revisit value in use. So as a result, that's what I was getting at when I put IPSAS 21 in as a maintenance project. IPSAS 31, intangible assets. IPSAS 31 right now shares a lot of characteristics or a lot of similarities with IPSAS 17, property, plant, and equipment. Because we're proposing to replace IPSAS 17 with ED 78, again, this is an opportunity to update guidance in IPSAS 31 to better align with a standard that it was previously aligned with. And then the last one, IPSAS 33, first time adoption of IPSAS. This has been a project that's been on the back burner for a while. And it goes back to the reason why I included in the maintenance projects is going back to a point that I just highlighted, as more and more stakeholders move to accrual accounting and hopefully some version of IPSAS, the more useful we can make IPSAS 33, the better we can support their movement along the curve to accrual accounting. This slide is something we've kind of put together over the past few years, and what it highlights are the challenges that the board faces when it's developing standards. And the reason I put it up is, even though we developed in the context of what the board considers on an ongoing basis in developing its guidance, it's something that I'm sure will be in the back of people's minds when we're adding projects to the work program. I won't go to each of them in detail, but what I find interesting about this list is not only do members have to balance out between the different challenges, but members also have to balance within the challenges themselves. So a good example is this yellow group of boxes, and this is what I call the reliance on other standard setters in developing our guidance challenges. And I always think of this as some of our stakeholders would really like to align with IFRS as much as possible. And for every stakeholder that would like to prioritize that, we have another stakeholder that would like to be purely public sector specific and independent of any other guidance. And then for every stakeholder that we have that prioritizes public sector independence, there's another stakeholder that would like more alignment with GFS. So this is something we're always trying to balance as a board. The light blue boxes focus on what I consider conceptual issues. a good example of principle versus rules is the board had a discussion 2 or 3 days ago in revenue on enforceability and talked about this at the principles versus rules level. And then if I go to the quality box, this is something where there's always this tension between quality and time to market. We can really sacrifice one or the other. And then finally, IPSAS suite of complete. When is the IPSAS suite complete? And what do we do once it is complete? So it's always this tension as to which projects we take on and how much do we allocate to actually completing a complete suite of IPSAS. I started with the Rubik's Cube because that's always I think it's a good illustration of what we're trying to deal with here. It's kind of spinning the cube around to get it to all work, but we have a number of considerations. The board is ultimately the group that has to deal with this. And then what I wanted to highlight here is every jurisdiction, even within jurisdictions, there's different views on how to consider each of these different perspectives. So if I've outlined what the sandbox is and the population that's in the sandbox, what I'm trying to do with the next few slides are outline the considerations that we'll have to use in prioritizing the projects in that sandbox. So I'll talk to each of these a little more in the next few slides, but prioritization criteria were identified by the IPSASB as what we would consider in the strategy work plan whenever we select a new project. Environmental factors are what I've identified as changes since the strategy work plan was originally issued. And then resource constraints is really our constraint that we'll have to consider in selecting the number of projects to add to the work program. So you saw this project prioritization slide yesterday when Ian went through it and reminded everyone what was in the strategy work plan. I don't think there's anything revolutionary here, but I think it's good to remind members that this is what we agreed to consider when we were selecting new projects and prioritizing them. I won't go into detail on these because I do want to get to the breakout sessions. And again, I think they're fairly straightforward and just the words themselves remind members is what we have to consider. This slide starts to move into the environmental factors, and something that struck home to me was a constituent indicated that we need to consider how many IPSAS are coming out over the next few years, and that we might need to slow down on how much guidance we're issuing and allow our stakeholders to catch up. And I put this slide together reflecting on that comment. And like I said, one stakeholder will go that way, another stakeholder will go the exact opposite direction. But when I put this together, it really made me realize that over the next 5 years, we have a number of IPSAS coming out, and that will be a challenge for our stakeholders in implementing all of them. Ross just went through this slide. It is, like Ross said, hot off the press. And what really, my big takeaway from this slide is, as you see that green bar and even the orange bar go up over the next 5 to 10 years, when I think of this, is how do we ensure that projection becomes a reality? How do we support that? And how do we help people that are moving to accrual hopefully move to some form of IPSAS as well? And to me, that's really making the IPSAS useful and usable to our stakeholders. Now I'm moving into the resource constraints. Not a whole lot to say on this slide. I think what it really emphasizes, though, is when I look at the members level, even though we have more members than the IASB, their members are full-time. This is all they do. They focus on the objectives of the IASB. And it's very difficult for a volunteer board to keep up in that regard. When I look at staffing and financial resources, in each case, the IASB has about 10 times the staffing and 10 times the resources that we do. So we have to be very cognizant of where we allocate our resources, because allocating our resources to projects that can take 10 years to complete takes away from other projects that might be higher priority for our constituents. This slide is a graphical representation of where we're going with our work program. It hasn't been updated for Tuesday's discussion with Ross on changes to it, but it still highlights the key point that I wanted to make, and that's that blue triangle in the top right. And what that blue triangle is highlighting is we are seeing more and more capacity come up in 2022 and then in 2023. And as a result, that leads into my next slide, where I think in 2022, we can probably take on one major project. And then in 2023, as more staff becomes available, we can take on a second major project. When I was thinking about major and minor projects to me are projects like revenue or measurement, projects that require more than one staff and require a significant amount of greenfield thinking. Minor projects are generally our alignment projects, projects that require one staff or can be completed while the major projects are out for consultation. This will be one of the points that the breakout sessions will discuss. This is staff's initial view that we should have 2 major projects and 3 minor projects. And then earlier this week, staff had an internal discussion and talked about what we thought would be a straw man of which projects we thought would be the most appropriate to include in the work program. We discussed about the pros and cons of sharing with the IPSASB. We thought it would be, we ultimately decided we would share it, and I'll share it in a second, because we thought it would be an easier place to start in the breakout sessions. We thought it'd be easier to for you to have something to agree with or critique, rather than starting with the list of 10 projects that I provided. So when staff looked at the 2 major projects and 3 minor projects, we thought a good place to start would be with the 2 major projects, presentation of financial statements and differential reporting. I won't get into too much on the why of these 2 projects. I'll leave that to the breakout sessions, but I will talk for a minute on the why we didn't pick the other 2 research projects. And the other 2 research projects were tax expenditures. We didn't highlight this as one of our major projects that we should put on our work program because this received the lowest amount of support from our constituents in the strategy and work plan. And then we didn't put on discount rates because when we went to the project prioritization criteria, the aspect that we really struggled with on discount rates was feasibility. From my perspective, I think it'll be a really challenging project to land. We've had other standard setters internationally and nationally look at this project, and they generally step away from it because they just don't know how to land it. On our 3 minor projects, I talked about these as the maintenance project on a previous slide. So my last 4 slides relate to the breakout sessions. So you will have seen this in the paper, but what we really want the breakout groups to focus on are which projects. I gave you a list of 10 projects, the populations of projects, I'll call it. Are there any projects you think should be added to that list? Are there any projects you think that should be removed? If you think any project should be added, please remove one as well, because we do have limited resources. And then what I think is the most important question, which projects should be prioritized? To help the groups with these discussions, what we've done is staff has created 2 slides that staff will complete in the background while the breakout sessions are ongoing. You'll see these slides right at the beginning of the breakout session, and they're just to help summarize the views of the breakout session group so that the breakout session chair can bring it back and present to the IPSASB when we come back from those sessions. The breakout session we'll have these discussions in the context of what I just went through, definitely in the context of the prioritization criteria. And then you'll obviously have to consider the resource constraints, and then you'll probably want to consider environmental factors as well. From a logistics point of view, we've allocated 60 minutes to these breakout sessions, and we plan to have 15 minutes after for a break. The way I see these happening is we'll open the breakout sessions and staff will welcome all the individuals to the breakout session. After about 5 minutes, we'll turn it over to the breakout session chair, at which point it will be an open discussion for participants in the breakout session to provide their views. Because there's around 10 members, I think you'll probably still have to use the raise hand feature, but please, everyone that's in the session, please join in, please contribute. This is a good opportunity to give your views. If you can, keep your camera on. And then following the breakout sessions in the break, we will have feedback with the IPSASB. the last slide, and Ian, you can take over if you want while this slide's up. This is just allocating all the members to the groups. So I'll leave this up for a second if Ian, you want to take over.